Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 32 of my secular Bible study series in which we are looking at Jonah. And what a weird and strange little book this is. It really flips the script between a lot of what we've seen going on between God and his prophets. Is God actually the good guy in this story? And if so, how accurate is it? We're going to get into all of that. We're going to be returning to our 7 normal points to help work our way through this book and understand it as well as we can from an objective and secular point of view. So without further ado, let's get into point 1, book overview. And for this, I'm just going to walk you through these 4 chapters. We're going to talk about the story in a little more detail and help you understand what is going on. To start in chapter 1, we have Jonah flees the presence of the Lord. Here God is telling him, go to Nineveh. Nineveh is a huge city. Historically speaking, we know that it was filled with Babylonians and Persians and Assyrians. Again, it is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. So just a huge area of trade, lots of cultures going on there. And obviously God wasn't pleased with these people for their wickedness. Were they really any different than any other city at this time? Probably not. Were they that different than Israel themselves? Probably not. They worshiped different host of gods. They attacked and defended territory, like pretty common stuff here. But God seems to not like them, so he's going to send a warning via his messenger Jonah. But Jonah doesn't want to, and we don't find out right away why he doesn't want to go. But on his way to a different city to avoid having to go to Nineveh, the great storm happens. This part I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The storm comes and all the sailors on the ship start praying to all of their different gods, hoping that one of them is real or at least powerful enough to do anything about this. And when that's not working, they cast dye to try to figure out what's going on. And I always think it's funny when God works through these other magical properties, essentially, whether it is having Aaron's rod turn into a snake, just like the Egyptians were supposedly doing, or the necromancing that goes on in the Bible, or even in the New Testament, having the Zoroastrians, the wise men, the Magi, follow a star. That's their religion, reading the stars. The apologist will tell you, yep, God's using all these false things for his good, but it's very conflicting, I think. So anyways, they figure out Jonah's the problem. They ask him what God he serves and why isn't he praying, because somehow Jonah was just sleeping. And this is our first hint that the story is about to get ridiculous. The storm is to a point where all these people think they're going to die. Jonah is running away from a god that he is obviously terrified of, but he's just peacefully sleeping. Even running away from this god in general, like physically running away, is such a silly concept. So this is a good spot to say there's 2 ways that this book is looked at even by believers. One is literal. No, Jonah actually heard from God. He actually tried to disobey and run away. He actually got himself thrown overboard to appease the rest of the people on the ship so that they might live. He was actually swallowed by a great fish, etc. Like, there's the literal view, and then there's the, oh, this story is just a fun metaphorical story, but there's nothing in it to indicate that. Like, yes, we know that these writers were capable of using imagery, were capable of symbolism, were capable of metaphor, allegory, etc. But when we're supposed to draw this line is just so very obscure. Many miraculous events we're supposed to believe are factual, like the parting of the Red Sea. I don't know anyone that says that's a symbolic event in Exodus. So why, just because it seems so ridiculous that he would survive in the belly of a great fish for 3 days? And by the way, if you want to have a ton of fun, go watch some Christians try to argue the logistics and what whale it would have been. Oh, nope, it's actually great fish in the Hebrew. It's a sea monster. Okay, here's what we know about different sea monsters. Like, it's just hilarious to me to have grown men talking about the throat measurements of certain different creatures in the ocean to see which one a man could fit in and the level of the stomach acid and all this. But I digress. I'm getting way off track. So there's obviously the literal and the very metaphorical reading. And depending on which of those you take, we get different issues, which again is why it's so hard to ever argue with a Christian, because they can just flop to the other side if they get too far into a corner. But the rest of chapter 1 here is Jonah getting thrown overboard and God sending this great fish, is the correct terminology, not whale, to capture him in his mouth and hold him in his belly for 3 days and nights. That leads us to chapter 2, which is Jonah's prayer. It's a very short chapter. All of the chapters are short, but we get this prayer. It's not really an apology. It's more just a prayer of thankfulness to God for preserving him, which is going to be ironic considering what happens in chapter 4. But we do get a promise from Jonah that he will go to Nineveh. And it's kind of a bartering that he is doing from a position of no other choices here. So I also think that's interesting. So then we get to chapter 3, where Jonah is now been vomited out onto the shore by this great fish. He goes to Nineveh, which is so big, it's a 3-day walk across, and we hear just about his first day. Now, Jonah is really phoning it in. It's clear he doesn't want to be here. You know, when we compare his message to Nineveh with anyone, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Obadiah, whoever, their message for Israel, and they're going off about here's everything you've done wrong, and here's exactly what God's going to do, and here's how you can, recover yourself. Jonah doesn't give any of that in chapter 3. All he says is in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be overthrown. He doesn't mention God. He doesn't mention what their sins are. He doesn't mention what they need to do specifically. It's just 40 days and you'll be destroyed. And apparently, this is enough. And this is something that is actually harder to believe than the great fish story, that this entire supposedly very wicked city filled with many different beliefs and a king who did not previously serve this God, every single person in this city immediately repents. They even have their animals repent. No one eats, no one drinks, everyone wears sackcloth and ash, humans and animals. This is like the greatest revival story of all time, and based off so very little. And you know what? We saw that with the people on the ship too. I forgot to mention, after Jonah is thrown overboard, they say, God, please don't punish us. We don't want to take credit for this. We were just doing what he told us to do. And then they all made sacrifices, repented, and made oaths or vows to this God. So again, a real flip-flop. We see better prophets than Jonah with actual messages of warning and care for their people, and a stubborn people that don't repent, even though they're God's chosen people who absolutely should know and believe in what he's capable and willing to do. And the prophet is the good guy interceding with God, the bad guy saying, please, have mercy. Don't forget how amazing you are. And then you get Jonah, who's pretty excited about the destruction of Nineveh, if we're being honest. He does this weakest message possible, and yet it works perfectly and immediately. And it even works on God. At the end of chapter 3, the people have all repented, including their animals, and God forgives. He completely relents, which, by the way, pisses Jonah off here. I don't know if this book is like damage control for all the other books and all the times that God was awful and the prophet had to be the bigger man. And they're just trying to, again, it seems like flip it on its head here. But this story simply seems to really, really not fit. And for some strange icing on the top here, we get chapter 4, which is Jonah being really mad at God that he's not going to destroy Nineveh, and also making excuses for himself about why he ran away. We hear his justification. It's because, and he's doing this to just appease God after the fact, it's because, God, I knew you were so merciful and steadfast in your love and forgiveness that I never needed to go. That's why I went to the other city. I knew you were going to forgive them, which that doesn't make any sense at all. And then Jonah gets really sour and he says he wants to die, but he's out sitting in the field. He's made camp. He wants to watch Nineveh, which is a weird line. He wants to see what happens to Nineveh, even though we've already established that God is going to relent. That's why Jonah's mad in the first place. So what does he have to see? And then God does this weird thing, which is again, clearly just the writers trying to create something here, but we have more weird miracles. God immediately makes a tree that grows so fast it can provide shade for Jonah that very same day. And Jonah is now ecstatic. He is so happy. He loves this tree. But that night, God sends a worm to start eating and destroying this tree that is big enough to shade a grown man, but this worm is going to do damage. But then it didn't, because in the morning, God had to send a horrific wind to tear the tree down. And now Jonah wants to die again. And both times, God is asking Jonah, do you think you should be this angry? What right do you have? And he's asking Jonah these questions. And again, Jonah says, just let me die. And it ends with God's little speech to Jonah that you fell in love with this tree in just one day. You didn't make it, and yet you care about it. How much greater am I and my love for my people of Nineveh that I should care about them and want to give mercy to them? So finally, we have God looking like the good guy, looking like a God of love and mercy, even for other people outside of Israel. And Christians hang so much on this story theologically because of that. But if you're going to embrace that as something so good, you almost then have to turn around and judge all the other prophetic books that we've seen as the clear antithesis of that. The prophet bartering with God not to destroy, not to be petty. The more realistic aspect of these people not worshiping a God correctly, etc., instead of everyone falling to their knees and repenting immediately. So that's the book of Jonah. Let's move into point 2, authorship and date. Like most books, we have an argument. Traditional authorship goes to Jonah, which in this case seems very weird to be both the narrator and the main character in the story, and to have painted yourself in a bad light. So for those and many other reasons, scholars think that this is just something that was made up during the post-exile period. Again, kind of a moral teaching or a warning, but depending on how literal or metaphorical you want to take some of these facts, then we have to consider that it's somewhere between the 4th and 8th century BCE for dating, which leads us to point 3, historical accuracy, context, and background. So we know that the setting of the story is during the reign of King Jeroboam, which puts it at the 8th century BCE. So the question again is if this was written right away or a few centuries later. Most of this takes place kind of in a new territory for us within the Assyrian Empire, and we have the names of cities that we know and they actually existed. We do start to see some of the contradictions here though. Nineveh we know a lot about, and there's just nothing in its history, in its archaeology, in its neighbors and their writings and their history to suggest that the city ever went a mass conversion like the kind described in this book. We should have seen an influence of this, and there's just nothing. There's nothing at all to suggest that this happened. And it's not like this would have been something that was new for the Assyrians. In fact, we have writings left over and inscriptions that show that they were people that did listen to prophecy as it came into the city, that did look for signs and omens before military campaigns. So more than likely, Jonah was just another, in this case, a Hebrew who came in preaching his message, which again was very short and vague and probably off-putting. It just doesn't make any sense that this would have worked on everyone. It says everyone and the animals. In fact, I didn't read this to you. The very last line of chapter 4, the end of the book, is this: "And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" The focus on also the cattle being covered in sackcloth and not eating and drinking and participating in this fast, and then also that God mentions them here, that he cares. Like, what? God is the number one killer of cattle throughout this Bible. It's hilarious to me that, again, just completely flip the script for this one. As for point 4, literary analysis, we have a narrative, a cut and dry linear time frame. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. We don't really have poetry. You could count Jonah's prayer as maybe some kind of poetry, but it doesn't follow some of the same structure as the typical Israelite poetry that we've come to know. And in terms of techniques, unless we're talking metaphor, there's really not many. But if we are talking metaphorical, then we've got hyperbole, and we even could have satire. A good deal of irony is going throughout this. It just really depends how you take this book. And this one is one that I just see Christians so very divided on. You know, the reason so many of us even know about the story is because it's a fun one to tell to kids, supposedly, from the Christian perspective. But what we do with things like this and Daniel in the Lion's Den and all of the other huge miraculous acts from these prophets is we blow them out of proportion to teach them to children, to make them believe in this God and that he can do anything. And then when they grow up, we say, well, he can't, or he didn't, or he wouldn't have. And so here's how we can actually explain this way by not taking it too literally. And then they get mad at the individual who does take it literally to critique it. But in other cases, if we don't take certain aspects of the Old Testament literally, then this God can't even make sense. It's a very frustrating thing to go through. I think there's no indication that would separate this book from being taken as literally as Ezekiel lying on his side for a year, or Jeremiah's Lamentations, etc. Like, there's just nothing that all of a sudden becomes parable-esque about this, except for the measure of how ridiculous it's gotten. But this is actually a return. If you think about everything that happened in the first 5 books of teaching, there are way, way, way crazier events that we are absolutely supposed to take literal. So if the only reason you're trying to make this book more metaphorical is because all of a sudden it feels like things have started to feel more mystical, magical, and supernatural, that's only because we've had a few slow books. The biggest inconsistency I see, by the way, it is that God is merciful, especially for a city that is not his own. That is the biggest thing that contradicts what we've seen in the rest of this story. A big fish swallowing a guy and keeping him alive in his stomach for 3 days, no problem, compared to this God showing mercy. I kind of feel like I've already made my case for point 7 with everything that's problematic, but let's move on to point 5, main themes. Instead of divine wrath, we can finally say this has a theme of divine mercy. God is making a case and even does an example to Jonah to help him understand, look, as much as you care for this tree that you've only known a day because of what it can do for you, even though you didn't make it, think of how I feel for all of my creation. Like, that actually looks pretty good. And if that's all this Bible was, we wouldn't have all these issues. So credit where credit is due. We have a theme of mercy finally. A second theme might also be that of obedience, because in the very same breath, when I say we have a God of mercy, we also have a God that was willing to collectively punish and murder every single person on that boat because of the sins of one man. Just like he was ready to collectively kill the entire city of Nineveh for the wickedness that can't be everyone, right? Like that can never be the case. Are children not innocent? You have Christians argue for the age of accountability, even though it's not clearly stated here in the Bible, because children are innocent up until they can know better. So then if God ever does kill children in the Old Testament, which he does all the time, we're told it's because, they weren't innocent. They were going to grow up and be like their parents. The inconsistencies, it's just crazy. Is it okay to kill children or not, Christians? A third theme that really gets pulled out of this book that isn't found elsewhere would be like universal salvation. God cares for everyone. Right? This is like the first time we really see God caring for anyone outside of his chosen people group. And instead of it being the one-off that it is, Christians make it the standard. False. Point 6 is one that I'm starting to not want to include as much. It's reception and influence, and traditionally we've looked at how maybe the Jewish tradition looks at the book versus how the Christian tradition looks. It's not even so much Jewish versus Christian, it's just which sect believes what. And it really comes down to if we take it as a funny little story to show God's love and mercy, or we show it as something literal. So depending on how seriously you take it might depend on the reception and influence that you see leaked down, but everyone knows this story. There are countless movies and stories and allegories and music that are based off this concept. This idea of God giving the individual a timeout until they change their mind and are ready to follow him is one that we see passed down and rebuilt and restructured in many stories. And by the way, this Jonah story, this isn't necessarily new itself. There's a couple Mesopotamian myths, can't remember the name, something with an A. It doesn't want to follow the god Anu, goes through something similar. Same thing in the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have Gilgamesh not wanting to do what Ishtar told him to do, and he faces a great bull instead of a great fish. And then we see the theme of, okay, you got me. Now I'm willing. Here's my vow. I'll go do my duty. So again, this story and its themes are everywhere and always have been and probably always will be. And then point 7, which is contradictions and problematic passages. I don't really have contradictions other than the contradiction in the nature of this God, which we have already discussed at length. The contradictions that defy reality, like sleeping in a fish for 3 days, or a tree that grows overnight, or an entire city converting, like we have those and I've already covered them. The problematic passages are just the inconsistencies that I've discussed as well. There's not one particular thing that's terrible except the situations, again, the collective punishment of the two different groups. It's a very strange story. We just have this grumpy old, probably racist prophet. Like, he gives God an excuse, but what it really seems like is he just hates this city. He hates these people. He hates the outgroup, which would make sense, by the way, for everything that this people group has said about themselves up until this point. They are God's chosen people. God will give all the other lands to them. Anyone that gets in the way, God will take care of. The Assyrian Empire was an enemy. They are the ones who lay siege to the northern kingdom. So again, it's all just backwards, upside down, and inside out. But that's the story of Jonah. Or if you want the Sunday school version, it's God will almost kill you and the people you surround yourself with when you don't do what he wants you to do. So make sure that you obey God. You can dress it up however you want, and you can make the pictures as funny and engaging as you'd like, and you can talk about how God was merciful at the end. But the beginning of this story is the problematic part. You can't run from God. He knows everything. He'll track you down. He can follow you around, and bad things will follow you until you decide you're going to do what he wants you to do. Forget the supposed free will that this God gave to you. Do what he says or else. And then when Jonah wants to die and begs God twice, then God won't do it. How very, very silly. Anyways, that's Jonah. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this one. And until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Sparky, Stephanie, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you simply enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.